So once again, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Canoe Museum's first online members-only talk, one of the exciting new benefits of museum membership. We are so excited to have you here with us this evening, where the museum's Executive Director, James Raffin, will lead you through a talk on the captain in the canoe, Kirk Wipper, and the founding of the Canadian Canoe Museum. James will also field any questions you may have at the end of the presentation. The presentation will last for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a period of questions. Speaking of questions, if you would like to reach out to our presenter at any time, there is a chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen in the pop-up box. Please feel free to type in any questions you may have throughout the presentation. As all attendees are muted on this talk, other than the presenter, I will be happy to share those questions aloud with our presenter at the end of the presentation. By way of introduction, my name is Christina Skuse, and I am the Development Coordinator for the museum. But for the purposes of this evening's talk, I will be serving as your moderator. So like I said, if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to chat them in. But otherwise, James, I'm excited to turn the floor over to you to get us started for our first ever talk.
Hello, Christina. Hello, everybody. I'm sitting in Sealy's Bay, Ontario on the shores of Cranberry Lake. My hands are covered with about 4 different colors of paint, and I'll tell you more about that later, but I've been fixing up a canoe for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee pageant, which is set to leave for London on a military transport plane on Friday. It's kind of a long and shaggy canoe story, and it's a story that I'm sure Kirk Wipper would have loved. This presentation is really the first presentation I've ever done about Kirk, because Kirk has always been around, it seems. Kirk, founder of the Canadian Canoe Museum, collected his canoes, but he was always part, even when the collection was gifted to the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, he was always around. And of course, it's a little over a year ago now that he passed away suddenly. It's a little bit odd. It's also a little bit odd in the sense that I'm very excited about this being our first webinar. But as a kid, I used to listen to Alan McPhee on the radio, and he would always, sometimes late at night, and he would greet his listeners. He would say, hello, vacuum land, or those out there in vacuum land. So giving a presentation, I understand normally to be in a room where you get feedback and give and take. And so without that, but I do appreciate you joining us for this. It's something that the museum really is trying to work on, and with the help of our general manager, John Summers, and Christina Skuse, our new development coordinator, and all other staff and volunteers, we're really trying to find creative ways to reach out to our members, especially those who can't come easily to the museum. So this is an opportunity that is available to anybody, close to the museum or not, and we hope it'll work. And so this is the first in what we will, well, Christina will tell you more about that, an ongoing series of presentations. And we're really hoping that it's going to work. Kirk Wipper was a man of vision. He was a man of practicality, and those two qualities combined to some of the craziest capers. I suppose the craziest of all is that one man collected something in the order of 500 canoes because he thought they would be important. But this was not a detached process by any means. And if you're on this call, I suspect you know Kirk well, or you've perhaps met him. But it was one picture that sums up for me Kirk Wipper. I think it's probably this one. Here's the Bluebird, which is a Salish racing canoe from the west coast of Vancouver Island. And it had somehow, well, through an intermediary called Alec Weber, been connected to Kirk, and Simon Charlie, the builder and the owner of this canoe, who claimed it had never lost a race. I mean, canoes are still being raced like this on the west coast. That's a one-piece dugout That's 3 times longer than the truck. But so Kirk knew he had a canoe in the sort of 16 to 17 meter range, and what did he do to go and pick it up? Well, he drove himself, for starters, and just put some longer racks on the pickup. And I'll tell you more about that. But so it's a mixture of feelings that I have as a kid who went to Kirk's camp, Camp Candelore. That's when I met him, when I was probably 5 years old or so. But also as a volunteer and staff member at the Canoe Museum, I have lots of thoughts and feelings. And so this is kind of a crack at saying a few words about Kirk and how the Canoe Museum came to be. And it's also a way of kind of organizing thoughts and ideas and materials for an exhibit that we're going to do, which may in fact be called The Captain and the Canoe. That was a term coined by Rick Beaver, who's from Alderville First Nation, north of Peterborough. And Rick was centrally involved in communicating with First Nations across the country regarding our Origins Gallery, well, about the collection generally. And when Rick couldn't come to Kirk's memorial service, he sent a lovely letter that I think we read at the memorial service. But he coined the term, the captain and the canoe. Kirk always liked to, well, later in his life, introduce himself as Captain Kirk, of course, referring to William Shatner or James T. Kirk, whoever you like. But he had that kind of captainly presence about him, and on it went. The last time I was actually with Kirk one-on-one was about a year before he died, and he really wanted to go to Victoria Island in Ottawa to be with his friend William Commanda, an Algonquian elder who had been a friend of Kirk's for a long, long time. And this is another image that sticks in my mind of Kirk. He and I had driven along Highway 7, took a sort of the slow boat to Ottawa, and because he was diabetic, he had, well, I was on strict instructions from his wife Ann to feed him at the right times. Well, we actually went into, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on a Friday night, we went into a tavern in Perth to get something to eat. And Kirk was sitting there looking at all these people, professional people from Perth, walking into this, well, I don't know, nice watering hole. And a woman walked in. I don't know, she might have been a lawyer or something, but she was dressed fully in leathers with fringes and stuff. Obviously, it got into her motorcycle garb. And she was chatting away, and Kirk caught her eye. And she'd gone down the line at the bar and sort of greeted everybody. And he looked up from his club sandwich and said, "What am I, chopped liver?" And he wanted a hug too. So he stood up and she came over. And then to my absolute mortal dismay, he turned to me and said, "Well, what about my friend?" And so anyway, I got a hug from a total stranger from Kirk too. But off we went to Victoria Island. And before anything could go on, he wanted to support William Commanda, who wants to turn this island right behind Parliament into a sacred shrine, I suppose, an Aboriginal gathering place. But he wanted to go to the river. And so there he is with his walker, heading on down. He knew Canada in ways, I think, that many people don't. I think his view of the country began with rivers, and of course what attaches us to the rivers are the craft of the people who were here first. And we heard lots about Kirk at his memorial service, which is almost exactly a year ago at the museum. And that was also one of our first web ventures. That was simulcast or webcast as part of the proceedings. And we have an archival copy in the library for posterity. But that was a chance for Kirk friends to come and say goodbye. But his actual burial, if you like. He was cremated, and some of his ashes went to his homestead in Manitoba, and some were buried in Toronto. And of course, one of the important places in his life was Camp Candelore, and so family gathered there. And Mike Chartier, his longtime friend from Iroquois Falls, made a bark canoe, and they put Kirk's ashes in it off Chapel Island. And in what sounded like a tremendously moving evening, they wrote recollections of Kirk and put them in bottles and sent them out on the lake as had been done on last nights at camp. But then in the flare that was uniquely Kirk's, they lit the canoe on fire with a flaming arrow. Well, it wasn't one flaming arrow. I gather it was, it was several flaming arrows. The first few missed, which is also vintage Kirk, if you like. But there's a little bit of Kirk in Lake Quebecois, and that's something. And the camp itself that Kirk had bought, and where the Canoe, where the collection was really started, remembers Kirk with this phrase that he spoke and that he wrote from time to time. And I think at the core of Kirk Wipper was an educator. But when he says to know, to care, to act, when he thought about any human enterprise, it had a knowledge component, which is sort of the front brain part of the cognitive part of the learning. But knowledge was more than that to Kirk. But knowledge had to have a balance. You had to care, and there was an ethical component to knowledge, and that was important to inculcate that in people, and of course to act. And it was never enough just to know or to feel. Kirk felt that you had to act, and of course he acted in many different ways, as an athlete, as a teacher, as a collector, as a founder, and that's his legacy at Candelore, and that's a place where anybody who wants to follow his path might want to go at some point. It's actually a lovely camp, still operating full steam ahead. It's now co-ed, but just about halfway between Minden and Dorset on Highway 35. Throughout his life, for his contributions to canoes, to canoeing, but also to camping, to leadership, Kirk was honored in just about all of the ways that you could possibly be honored by the country, the province. So here on the left side of the screen, he's getting the Order of Ontario, which he got before he got his Order of Canada, which is on the other side. And then he became a Knight of the Hospitallers of St. John's, which is, that's the organization that gave us St. John's Ambulance, but that's the Knights Templar. That's an ancient, ancient order of people who've made a commitment to make the world a better place. And there he is in his full regalia with sword and red flag with the Maltese. That was huge recognition for a kid who grew up in the Interlake region of Manitoba. So this is God's country. This is gypsum mines, and it's forest and scrub farms. But his parents were German immigrants to Canada, and that's where they ended up, in this little place called Grahamdale. And that's where Kirk was born back on December 6, 1923. And one of his early distinctions is that Grahamdale might as well have been on another planet from Winnipeg. The train went up and down, but Kirk it was very much a lonely kind of place, but everything happened at those days through the mail. And one of the things that the family did is that there was a good kid contest in Manitoba, and there's the kid who won. That's Kirk A.W. Wipper, standing there with a fish. But you look around and you see in this picture some of the other parts of his life. There's a stone boat behind 2 draft horses that aren't huge draft horses, but they're obviously work animals. And the stone boat, I mean, it looks like this ground is sort of being tried to be cleared. What's he got in there? Some sort of an in-ground storage place for fish. It's hard to know. And then, of course, there's some kind of a tree line over there. This is rough country, though, and but that's where Kirk grew up. It was sort of on the margin of the wilderness, and this was his parents carving out a farming life with crops, mixed cropping, and a few livestock, but very self-reliant. There's the happy kid who went up. But probably one of the most influential aspects of his growing up was a friend or a neighbor who encouraged Kirk to join the Lone Scout movement. Of course, Boy Scouts and Girl Guides was started by Robert Baden-Powell after the Boer War, sort of at the start of the 20th century. He borrowed generously from the woodcraft teachings of Ernest Thompson Seton, but the Scout movement really got momentum worldwide, and part of that Scout movement that was actually initiated in the United States was the Lone Scout, and Kirk was a Lone Scout, so sort of a Scout by correspondence. And if you look at the kinds of things and the ways in which Kirk interacted, especially with First Nation people, and his sort of sense of woodcrafter and how canoes fit into this larger suite of sensibilities having to do with First Nation people. That is very much, I think, a function, not so much of his First Nation neighbors around Grahamdale, although there were friends and neighbors, First Nation friends and neighbors. A lot of his sort of sensibility about reaction to and relationship with wilderness came, I think, from the Lone Scout movement, and that, I think, was really quite profoundly influential. He did his elementary school in Grahamdale, but then he did secondary school by correspondence, living in Grahamdale up there and doing so. Obviously a man of some discipline, a man of many interests, and a person who could juggle those many interests with a successful matriculation diploma. And when he was finished his high school at about, I'm still trying to get the date sorted out, but somewhere around 14 or 15, he headed to Winnipeg to normal school. Normal school is teachers' college, basically. And at the Winnipeg normal school, he trained there. He also got hooked up with the YMCA in Winnipeg, and he actually taught at a sort of middle school for a little while. This is coming into the late 30s now. Taught school, and that would have probably gone on had not something happened. But the connection, normal school, in those days you could go right from being a high school student to coming and getting some lessons at the normal school and actually becoming a teacher without any further youniversity studies. While he was in Winnipeg, he affiliated with the YMCA, Mind, Body, and Spirit, the Young Men's Christian Association. And he also did some studies in geology at the University of Manitoba. And I just found some correspondence recently between his dad and Kirk. He didn't like the math. Was part of that. And he didn't, I'm not sure he finished that year, but something even more substantial happened than his dislike of math. The war came along, and the Second World War, and Kirk in Winnipeg joined the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve, and that, I think, was an incredibly potent and important turning point in Kirk's life. He joined the reserve, and so that meant meeting and marching and learning in Winnipeg, but because it was a war was on, the reserve was invited to join the war effort, and he actually ended up on HMCS Runnymede, which was a destroyer that ran the North Atlantic, and in fact was involved for a time in a conflict that many Canadians were involved in, which was the Murmansk Run. This was taking supplies into the only ice-free port in Russia, up around Norway, which was occupied by the Germans. And Kirk never said much about what happened on HMCS Runnymede, but he always, I think, was, that was part of who he was, the discipline of it, the importance of mental discipline, of physical fitness, of mental fitness. And I think a lot of that he took out of his war service. He actually finished out the war in the Naval Reserve. And with the opportunities that were made available to veterans, he was able then to turn a very significant corner in his life and make the move from Winnipeg. He went home to Winnipeg, obviously, but he went home and with the encouragement of some of his teachers and friends at the YMCA, he headed to the University of Toronto. And at the University of Toronto at Hart House, he studied physical education. And in fact, that built the foundation of a lifetime of teaching and scholarship, more teaching than scholarship, but as an academic, as a professor at the University of Toronto. And if you go into that circle, you can, I mean, Hart House, the phys ed complex, still looks like that. It's a lovely little court at UT where Kirk is remembered. But there he is in the middle of the water polo team in 1946-47. He was an Adonis-like character. He was incredibly fit, he was incredibly coordinated, and he did amazingly well in wrestling, in water polo, and he was on varsity teams, and he really turned a lot of heads there. But it was also there that he was building his notions of what makes a human being whole. Just being an athlete really wasn't enough. You had to be of sound mind, body, and spirit, and you had to know to care to act. So it would be in his studies at U of T where he learned about the work of Benjamin Bloom and learned about the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains of learning. But he always defined who he was and what he did with activity. And so his legacy at U of T is the athletics that he did there. But through his time there after the war, he did graduate with a Bachelor of Physical and Health Education, Bachelor of Social Work shortly thereafter, and in his position as an instructor at Hart House, there was encouragement, as there is in most universities, for people who teach there to seek higher degrees. And it was as a result of that pressure that he did a Master of Arts and a Master of Education in the late 50s, early 60s. And in fact, he did go on and did some coursework for doctoral work at the University of Northern Illinois. And although many people call him Dr. Wipper, he was in fact never consummated a PhD. But while he was at U of T, some very important things happened. And he always, the same way he'd been kind of polyphasic and did many things out on the farm in Grahamdale, just doing athletics was not enough to keep him entertained, I think. And he actually got involved with youth at Illahee Lodge, at Pinecrest Camp, and the growing and starting Camp Leadership Center at Bark Lake. He got involved there. This is all sort of extracurricularly, but I think it was as a result of those experiences, which he'd never had as a kid, those organized camping experience, some of them episodic, like the Bark Lake camps were always just a week or two. Camp Pinecrest was kind of an ongoing camping experience where young men and young men came for longer. But it was there, I think, Kirk got the notion of creating a context for building Canadian people, building Canadian boys. And I think it was probably in his work at these kind of places where he got the notion that maybe one day he'd like to get his own camp, get his own operation underway. And early affiliations here too. In his early days at U of T, he affiliated with the Royal Life Saving Society, and he went on to a long service as a director with that organization, and also with the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. That, of course, were started by Kurt Hahn, who started Outward Bound, having been started a school called Salem in Germany, and early in the Second World War he moved to England and started Gordonston School and the Moray Badge, which was there. And it was interesting that Kurt Hahn also, like Kirk, thought that a whole human being can't just have head knowledge. They need to have knowledge of the heart, they need to have knowledge of the hands, they need to have knowledge of experience, and they need to encounter risk. And so the Duke of Edinburgh Awards still embody that much broader notion of what it means to be a complete human being. And Kirk, these were foundational things for Kirk as he went along the way. Also foundational was a nurse at Camp Pinecrest called Margaret, who became Mrs. Wipper. And also at that time, Kirk learned about this boys camp that was on Lake Quebecois. This would be early 50s now, and it turned out to be a place that was not too far from Bark Lake, not too far from Camp Pinecrest, and he actually was there, and he learned a bit about it. He met the owner, Keith Cleverton, and he actually worked there for a little while, but the camp went into crisis when Cleverton was charged with an offense that took him out of the camping movement, and this put Candelore on the block, basically. And Kirk was able to leap, and I don't know where he got the money, and I don't know how much he paid for it, but it was a highly influential decision in his life to purchase Camp Candelore, which was a number of acres, a large number of acres along the west and south shore of Lake Quebecois, and that turned into a great chunk of time. So what you're looking at here is Lake Couchag is the lake, the long lake in the top part of the picture. Highway 35 winds between these two lakes. Lake Quebecois is quite high up. It's a spring-fed lake, and it's not a very big lake, but there's a big dock that Kirk loved. OMG loved these crib docks. There's no floating dock for him after hunters shot the cables on a floating dock he had, and it drifted across the lake one fall. I remember going there as a kid watching Kirk pulling a piece of dock with a canoe. It was a very impressive maneuver. But after that, it was crib docks, and so any person who worked at Candelore, we would always be in the water in May, freezing, terribly cold water, fixing the docks, which would always get bashed around by ice. But swimming was a huge component. Canoeing was a huge component. So to the right of the rectangular yellow dock, you'll see some canoes that are there. And so there was on-the-water canoe training. Chapel Island is to the left. And but the whole premise of this camp was that these skills that you would learn in a stationary setting, maybe not sailing, but, well, maybe sailing. You'd learn about nodding, that kind of. The skills that you learned at this stationary place were really to enable you to travel by canoe into Canada. And for many, many Candelore people, that's what went on. And it was that kind of canoe as connection to Canada, I think, that really gave the Canoe Museum, or it's in that idea that the Canoe Museum had its genesis. Kirk was always very physical there, but would always be telling stories of explorers or people who've been out and about. And he had the most amazing ability to inspire little kids to rise to the occasion, whether it's knocking the camp director off the South Shore Bridge, or going on an expedition and looking like Huck Finn and giving the possibilities there, to learning about nutrition and carrying on, being creative. But it was an opportunity where Kirk really shone. He was right in the middle of that, as a young man, he was a very inspiring leader, and I think that affection that he generated with people at Canoe is affection that lives on in many, many people who were prepared to support him, whatever it was he decided to do. Incredible specimen right through his life, actually, but especially as a young man. There was a bit of showman in him, I think, where he would strike a pose or do something incredibly physical just because he could. And I think when we do the exhibit, a picture like this or something should be there, because I think that's a vintage Kirk image there. But the idea that learning was about more than science and math lived large in Kirk's world. So you'd learn about Native people, you'd learn about international situations, his version of it anyway, and it would be, I mean, you'd learn to shoot, you'd learn to paddle, but you would also learn to take chances on stage. And this was important to Kirk. But in the middle of all that, there was a kind of I don't know, magnetism or charisma, I guess it was, that people started to notice. And sure enough, the CBC in its early days heard about this guy who did amazing things with young people. And there was actually a series that ran for a couple of years in the late 50s and early 60s called A Walk with Kirk. And really what it was Kirk wandering along the Cushog Lake Portage, pointing out plants and so on. But the Walk with Kirk, you know, just like Survivor Man first did it near his home in a washing machine or wherever it was that Les did that, and then he branched out to other types. Same thing with The Walk with Kirk. But he was gaining a reputation that went beyond the camp and beyond the university. And that brought other people to the camp and to the university. And Kirk started building a kind of a network of people, interesting, eccentric, connected people. So here's Chief Kitpoo. His name is Jim Munster, and he's an incredibly iconic Canadian. His totem poles are actually still outside the Kelowna Museum and various other places. There wasn't a drop of First Nation blood in Jim Munster. He was actually an orphan from Oshawa, but he kind of played this role like Long Lance or Grey Owl, and Kirk was drawn to him. And he was almost like a character from a play or a circus or something. But he, at his core, Kitpoo, Chief Kitpoo, really was very interested in letting people know that there was a First Nation heritage around the North American continent and elsewhere, and that other people needed to know about it. Highly contentious now, Indian nights at camp and that kind of thing. But again, this links back to Kirk's belief from his Lone Scout experience that this was a worthy way to remember the First Nations and to bring them forward. And of course, anything that happened at Candelore always was underpinned by canoes. And you did skill training on the water, and that learned how to do shakeouts. And that, of course, led to trips to longer places. So there he is. That's probably 1962 or so with Margaret on a log, just looking out at Ghost Island on Lake Quebecois. That's actually taken by my dad, who happened to be at the camp, an old Kodachrome slide. But that was Kirk. He'd take all the summers off, and Margaret helped, and she was a tremendous help. And although they separated later on, he continued to have great admiration for Margaret right through her life. She has subsequently died, but it was a family affair, and sometimes a family affair, I think, that pulled hard on the family so that they would rise to the occasion to help Kirk do what it is that he wanted to do. And of course, what he wanted to do that kind of grew out of the camp was, well, one day, one of his professors gave him a canoe which was a beautiful basswood dugout canoe that's in the museum now in our memorial exhibit for him, made by the Payne brothers of Lakefield. And that canoe was put up in the rafters of the Candlore Dining Hall. If you look at those, there are two servers there. There's a woman, a young woman, and a young man. And the Payne brothers canoe was in the rafters just above, sort of halfway between in the annex there. And if you look around the dining hall, you actually, I mean, there's Lone Scout written all over this. This is, you know, the way that trips were recognized, the way that achievements, whether it's Lone Watch, which is staying up all night and keeping a fire going, or Master Canoeist, this is all on the walls here. But the canoes, Kirk thought if we were going to learn anything about Canada, we'd better learn about the canoes. So Professor Griffith, one of his teachers at U of T, gave him this. And well, he put that up there, and next thing you know, well, other canoes came from other places, some of which he paid for, some of which he didn't. And lo and behold, it came to a point where he thought, what on earth am I going to do with these canoes? And that was where the idea of the museum really had its genesis. So he was interested in the canoe history and lore, and he had started to get all these canoes. People gave them, and somehow he sometimes traded things for canoes. But it was there that he actually built, as a camp program, a house for these canoes that became the Canoe International Museum. And interestingly, the evolution of this at Candlore started first as a home for these canoes that he thought he could manage on his own, but then he realized that he'd need to create something, an organization that would allow him to gather money to do this. But it was always done his way, and along it went. But it really did come to a point where people were really drawn to this collection of canoes. And some of the correspondence that he had, well, here's a guy. So Kirk would tell people about what he was doing, and always kind of mention that, you know, this doesn't come out of the air. And so here's a guy sending him a $1 bill to cover the postage for a return letter with a question he has. And as he went around and started looking kind of actively for these craft that would create a portrait of this country called Canada that was his home, he met people like William Commanda. And there he is with William up in Maniwaki in the early days, negotiating for a birch bark canoe. And of course, the most iconic canoe in the collection still, I think, and certainly one of the most photographed, is one of William Commanda's canoes, story canoes. And that was a lifelong friendship with these two guys. And they turned up in the craziest places. There they are at a picnic at the Governor General's house in Ottawa. And well, that friendship was something that I think kind of gave Kirk some sort of connection to the First Nation world. But I think they were both trying to pull off impossible projects and supported each other. William was trying to have his people recognized, and he was, before his death, just after Kirk, or just before Kirk, sorry. He was actively trying to turn Victoria Island into this this shrine for First Nation people, and I think that's actually in the works now. But Kirk also was able to enlist the help of other people, including a woman who went to do a PhD at U of T in social anthropology called Alika Wipper. And she never did finish her PhD, but she became a really important sort of collection builder for Kirk. And she did a lot of work on the West Coast. She would find things and want to help him. And that's where there's a great correspondence of them going back and forth, the things she would find. And there are many canoes in the collection, including the Bluebird that Alika found, and Kirk somehow then purloined, or not purloined, but procured. This Bluebird story just makes me laugh, and as we kind of wind up here, so it's out in Duncan on Vancouver Island, and Kirk takes his pickup out, his best pickup truck, to bring it home. And it's just so Kirk. So he gets on the ferry to get from Duncan, or to get from Vancouver Island back to Vancouver. The ferryman takes one look at this thing and says, "Sir, that'll cost you the equivalent of 4 vehicles." He said, "Well, no. We'll hang the end of this thing out over the end of the ferry, so that takes care of that. And you can take those 2 little Volkswagens or whatever they are, and you can park them underneath there. I'll only be paying one price." And well, then he took a look at the mountain ramparts on the Canadian side and realized that, well, he didn't think he was going to get this massive canoe through some of the rock cuts in the Rockies. So he headed south and was promptly stopped by state troopers who said, "Sir, you've got an illegal load there." And well, he explained that yes, it probably was an illegal load, but this was a work that was absolutely critically important to remembering the First Nations of the West Coast, and was going to a museum in Ontario. And he was so convincing, as Kirk could be, that state trooper escorted him to the edge of his territory and radioed ahead. And so all across from Washington through Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and Michigan, he was able to, over to the Sioux, he was able to get full escort, bringing the Bluebird home. The Bluebird, of course, which is in the Origins Gallery. Another huge, the joys of, sorry about that, the joys of live webinaring. Kirk, by this time, so we're now into the mid-60s or so, he is known to be collecting canoes, and the Hay Foundation, or the Museum of the American Indian in New York City, was actually deaccessioning quite an impressive collection of canoes. Wipper had found these, and Kirk, in an incredible series of negotiations and a final journey down to New York City with some of his family and friends, he was able to bring back really a treasure trove of canoes that really turned what was a sort of a private collection that was a bit hodgepodge with representation. It was never collected systematically, but all of a sudden there were many, many holes filled by these craft that came from the Hay Foundation, and all of a sudden he's in the serious collecting business. And that spurred him on to start thinking more systematically. And I showed you this picture before, but I've highlighted 2 people in the bottom right as Harold and Marion Penny. Kirk being an opportunist in the sense that he could see possibilities as they were emerging. Harold and Marion Penny were the bookkeepers at Candelore, and they were heading out to the West Coast for a holiday. And he said, "Look, I heard there's a guy in Masset called Victor Adams, and that he might be able to make a canoe." Now, this is the 60s. This is long before Lutos was made or anything. So Harold and Marion went out, and they did some negotiations that led to the creation of the first Haida canoe, probably in living memory. These had mostly been pulled up on beaches and rotted when motorboats came in the 30s. But Kirk went out there with Claude Cousineau and one other guy, and their original plan, if you can believe it, was to paddle from Masset on the north end of Vancouver Island over to the mainland through the Hecate Strait, which is probably one of the nastiest bits of tidal water in the country. And they never did make it, actually. They got picked up by a trawler partway along the way. But this was Kirk in full flight, collecting. This became part of a camp program as it arrived in Ontario. And it was, here's Kirk, the old Navy guy, having a Haida canoe in front of HMCS Haida in Toronto Harbor. There's his buddy Kitbu, and there's a staff, a bunch of campers from Camp Candelore, and that's right on the front page of the Star. So this is not the repatriation, but it's actually the journey of a Haida canoe to the museum, but with very much pomp and circumstance associated with it. And as it happened, this was in about 1972, as a staff member at his camp at that time, I got to take part in this charade, and there's your webinar guy in the back of that canoe, looking very much post-60 hippie-ish with a dark cookie dusting mustache. But what an incredible way to learn about canoes that was presented by Kirk. And he did realize, though, as the pressure came on, people were expecting to say, no, Kirk, you can't be paddling these things around all over the place. You've got to actually create a home for them. And that was a problem. It got too big for one man to do. And that's when he started looking around for another home for these. And this was a highly contentious move. Here's the Lake Kashikawigamah Tourist Association writing to whom it may concern to say, don't take this museum out of Halliburton because it's important to who we are. But I think Kirk had come to the place where he knew that he needed to find another home and find some more volunteer energy. And of course, that volunteer energy was what emanates from the Kawarthas in Peterborough, the energy that still drives the museum, that brought that collection to Peterborough in the early 90s, that created, through that group of dedicated people, including Molly Cartmel and Don Curtis, who are here, but many others who are still around. And the history of this thing coming together is really a history of transfer of a dream. And there are some bits of this history that are, the collection coming and being stored on the Coles farm near Peterborough. And of course, then the great deal that came out where the museum for $1 was able to buy the OMC building, well, where we are now. And that happened on the 11th of July, 2005. And first the front building, the Weston building was bought, and then the back building. The piece in between, of course, had been taken out in the sketch as well, which was all part of the OMC Outboard Marine Corporation building. And so in Peterborough, Ontario was where now he'd looked at Whitby, he'd looked at all those other places. But the passion that came with that also lingered on, and Kirk was very much involved in the early days. And a lot of days that was just the most positive thing that could ever be. But people involved with the museum would always say that, also say from time to time that it had its moments of tension as well. And but Kirk was always there. He was always keen to take people through, and was always kind of an eminence that was there as time went on. And but slowly, the strength of the volunteers, the staff involved with the museum, were able to come through and kind of take the dream and rebuild it and remake it and reshape it. And the early exhibits that were in what is now the Weston Center were just cardboard, or not cardboard, but plywood curbs and gravel. And where he would fit in this new organization was always a bit of a problem, but then it came up with the idea that he would be recognized as the founder. And that was, I think, in the end, a fairly happy place for him to be. As new craft came in, Kirk would be identified with this, but I think the museum then got a sense of its own identity as it started collecting more interesting and exotic canoes, from the sculptures like the Silver Canoe all the way through to Adam Van Couverden's gold winning canoe. And I think as the museum goes forward, it very much is infused with the spirit of Kirk Wipper, the kind of sense of possibility that can come from that. And so when Farley Mowat shows up and says, I've got a canoe that you want, the museum is able to accommodate him. And this collection that has kind of been built opportunistically is now much more systematically looked at by Jeremy, our curator, and John, our general manager, well, by the whole staff and all of the volunteers who are now managing this collection like the priceless portrait of Canada that it is, and trying to make it work as an organization. I think in the end, when I think about Kirk, going through the photos that are available since his death and even before, he was definitely a man of many hats. He loved hats, but in each of these is a different character. And each of those characters, I think, lives on in some ways at the Canadian Canoe Museum. And that's part of, I think, what we'll try to explore captain in the canoe. If you haven't seen A Passion for Canoes, Peg Media's film about Kirk going back to his home in Grahamdale, I'd highly recommend this. It's on DVD and it's in the library, but it's also available for sale. You can get it in the store. It's an absolutely fascinating thing. What set Kirk Wipper apart? He looked at this country called Canada and he realized it was a nation of rivers. And as such, it was a nation of canoes. And what burned in his guts was a real need to keep that connection strong and keep it alive. And that's the legacy that he leaves behind at the Canadian Canoe Museum. And that is the legacy that has led us on to make National Canoe Day, to try new things as they come along, whether it's webinars or whatever it is. And as I said, I'm covered with paint. I would have put my tuxedo on for you, but I didn't want to get paint on that. It's good to be well dressed for a webinar, but the paint has come from a caper that I'm sure Kirk's not far away, but you know the Queen has been on the throne for 60 years, and they're amassing 1,000+ vessels to fete her on June the 3rd, which is a week on Sunday. And through a whole series of wacky circumstances, we, the museum, have been able to put a canoe in that. And the canoe that we were going to put in February, but we're told wouldn't be acceptable, is fully programmed now. So I was actually able to find 2 canoes in a field in Merrickville. Here's the before picture. They're 30 years old and loaned to us by Paddle Canada. They're kind of fixer-uppers, but with friends and neighbors. If I was in Peterborough, it would be volunteers at the museum, but I'm not in Peterborough, and they were in Merrickville. So there's the before, and taken about 5 minutes before this webinar started, there's the after of the lower one of those. And it's the only time I've actually seen upholstered seats. But if you actually look at the national news tomorrow night, this canoe is going to be christened Canada 1 in Sealy's Bay, and Ron Charles, the reporter from the Nationals, coming down here. And it just makes me laugh because this is just vintage Kirk. Kirk would have absolutely loved this. I'm going to have a few friends and neighbors here. We're going to get in it and paddle it around, and I think we're going to break a Tetra pack of cheap wine over the front, and we're going to call it Canada 1 instead of thing on there. But that's a little taste of Kirk and how the Canoe Museum came to be together as our first webinar. Now we do have opportunities for questions that Christina is fielding. But also, Christina, before we go too much farther, wants to talk to you about the next webinar, which is happening on Wednesday, July 18th. Over to you, Christina.
Great. Thank you, James. I'll remind people just quickly, if you do have any questions, please type them in the question panel, and I'll be sure to field those to James for his answers. I should let you know to mark your calendar. Our next members-only talk is scheduled for July 18th at 7 p.m. And as you can see on your screen, our curator, Jeremy Ward, will lead you through an exciting talk on Canoes to Go, the search for a truly portable boat. Jeremy will also explore how our curatorial team comes to develop ideas on building new and intriguing exhibits at the museum. So stay tuned for more details in your next edition of the members e-newsletter about how to register for that talk. So we'll turn it over to some questions. James, the first question is, have all of the canoes from the Candelore Museum been captured in the current museum?
Absolutely not. The possibilities in that collection are, there are many multiples of the number of canoes. So I think there are about 120 actual craft in the Weston Center in the exhibits that are currently there. So if you mean by captured, are they on exhibit? No. Very excited that 5 Bay, our storage area, they actually are, you can actually look at them and see them. It's not a public space, but what's happened is as we think about the evolution and growth of the museum, we're thinking more and more about kind of black boxes where we can bring more craft out more often as opposed to more sort of static and permanent style exhibits. Last year we had What in the World is a Canoe, and that's a first exhibit of some of the international craft in the collection, some of which Kirk collected. This year we've got Canoes to Go, which is the first time some of the crazy folding take-apart canoes in the collection, the first time but there are all kinds of other themes that could be developed and crafts that we could use to develop those themes, and we're absolutely looking forward to that. And it's got even more exciting as we sort of morph the lobby of the museum into the McLean Matthews Gallery, and so at the very least we're changing that exhibit annually and allowing our flow through of new vessels all the time. And of course we're also looking ahead to the day when we will enact our strategic plan, which calls to put the collection and the exhibits in a new home on the water in Peterborough. And when we do that, our hope is, our being staff and board, our hope is that we will be able to have open storage there where, unlike where it's stored now, we will have the right number of washrooms and exits, et cetera, et cetera. And we actually, people like the War Museum, where you can actually walk through the storage and just absorb what's there, even though it's not interpreted.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a quiet group, and that's all the questions we have right now. But I will remind people, if they do have any questions following tonight's talk, please feel free to contact me. My contact details are on the screen, and I'll be sure to forward your questions on to James, and we'll make sure we get those answered for you. But otherwise, a special thank you to James for leading us through this first talk, and thank you to everyone that came out tonight to hear our first members-only online talk. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Good night, everybody.